I was 27 in the summer of 2019 when I decided to camp alone on an old rented farm property in southern Idaho. The owner was a quiet older man who lived 2 miles down the dirt road, and he told me the land wasn't used anymore except for hay cutting once every couple of years. I wanted a quiet place where I could be alone for a few days. No loud campsites, no neighbors, no traffic, just open fields, rough fences, slow wind, and the long empty sky. I brought a small tent, a basic cooler, a folding chair, and a little portable stove. I planned on staying 3 nights. The first afternoon felt peaceful. The land was almost too quiet. The fields were dry and yellow, stretching far until they touched a distant tree line to the east. There was an old barn about 100 yards from where I set up my tent. It leaned slightly to one side, with missing boards and a rusted metal roof. A long wooden fence ran past it, but half of the posts were rotting and crooked. I could smell old dirt and dry grass in the hot air. Everything felt empty, like the place had been forgotten for years. When the sun started lowering, the sky turned orange, and the barn cast a long shadow across the field. I felt that natural excitement you get when you know night is coming and you're outdoors alone. It wasn't fear yet, just that alertness that grows the darker it gets. I cooked simple food and watched insects climb up the side of my cooler. The air cooled fast after sunset, and the quiet turned heavier. There were no distant cars, no animals calling, nothing. Just the sound of wind brushing across dry ground. I crawled into my tent around 10, fully expecting an easy night. But I had trouble sleeping. The silence felt strange, almost too perfect, like I was waiting for something to break it. I kept hearing tiny movements in the grass, but I knew it was probably insects or small animals. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke up a couple hours later because the air felt different. Still silent, but heavier, like pressure had dropped. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. My body was tense for no reason I could explain. Then I heard it, slow steps in the grass. Not shuffling like a small animal. Not fast or light like a deer. Heavy, careful steps, spaced apart like someone walking slowly. The sound moved from somewhere near the barn toward my tent, then stopped. I held my breath. The air felt sharp. I didn't want to move the zipper or reach for my light. I just listened. After maybe a minute, the steps started again, but they angled away from me, circling around toward the other side of the tent. Still slow, still heavy, still measured. My throat felt tight. I knew animals didn't move like that, but I kept trying to tell myself it could be something else. A stray cow maybe, or someone from a nearby property checking the land. But nothing felt right about the way it moved or the timing. The steps faded after a while, and eventually I fell asleep again because my body was exhausted. The next morning the air was warm and still. I stepped out of the tent and scanned the area. The grass around my campsite looked slightly pressed down, but the wind could have done that. When I walked toward the barn, I saw something that tightened my stomach. On the dry dirt near one corner of the barn were footprints, adult-sized, bare feet. The edges of them were sharp enough to be recent. They led from the barn toward the field, then curved sharply and disappeared into taller grass. I stood there for a long minute trying to make sense of it. A person with no shoes walking around abandoned farmland in the middle of the night didn't make sense. The owner never mentioned anyone living out here. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to ignore it. During the day, I tried to focus on normal tasks. Cooking, reading, walking the field, but everything felt tense. Every time I looked at the barn, I felt like someone was watching from inside, even though I knew it was empty. At one point, I tried to look through the gaps in the boards. The barn smelled like old straw and rust, and the inside was mostly bare except for a few broken crates and a rusted water trough. Nothing alive, nothing strange. Still, the air inside felt colder than outside, which bothered me more than it should have. I told myself I'd only stay one more night. I didn't want to run back home over something that might be nothing, but I didn't want to push my luck either. When the second night came, I set up my lantern outside and let it run for a bit while I organized things inside my tent. The glow lit the dry grass in a soft yellow circle. The barn sat in darkness beyond the edge of it, its shape barely visible. I kept glancing at it as I moved around. Every time, it felt like the outline of the barn had shifted slightly, like the angle of it changed when I looked away. I knew that was impossible, but my mind kept playing tricks on me. Around 11, the lantern ran out of fuel, and I shut everything down. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind scrape the dry weeds. My chest felt tight with tension. I didn't know if I was imagining the danger or sensing something real, but either way my body believed it. Sometime after midnight, the steps returned. Slow again, careful again. This time they came from behind my tent, so close I could hear the grass flatten under each foot. I froze. My pulse thumped hard in my ears. The air felt thick and warm, but my skin was cold. The steps stopped directly beside the tent. I could hear breathing, very light but steady. Not animal breathing, too slow, too controlled. My arms felt numb. I stayed completely still, afraid even the sound of fabric shifting would give away that I was awake. After what felt like minutes, the steps moved again, heading toward the barn. When they faded, I slowly sat up. I decided that no matter what, I was leaving at sunrise. I barely slept after that. When the first light finally touched the tent, I packed everything fast. But before leaving, I forced myself to check the barn one last time. I felt like I needed to understand what was happening, or at least confirm that no one was hiding in there. The barn door was swollen from age and didn't open easily. I pushed it wide enough to slip inside. Dust floated in the morning light through the broken roof. The place looked the same as before except for one thing. In the dirt near the back wall was a bed-shaped spot of pressed-down hay and a small pile of food wrappers, old granola bars, half-eaten canned food, dried fruit packets. It looked like someone had been sleeping there, someone who brought leftovers from somewhere but didn't want to be found. Beside the pile was a scratched-up metal cup and a thin blanket rolled into a ball. The blanket had dark stains on it, brown and dried. There were also footprints, the same barefoot prints from outside. I felt a strong wave of fear because suddenly everything made sense. Someone had been living out here secretly. Someone who might have mental issues or was hiding from something or just didn't want people around at all. Someone who walked at night, barefoot, quietly, circling my tent. Someone who stood only a few feet away while I slept. I stepped out of the barn and felt the sun warm my face, but my whole body was cold. I packed the last of my gear, loaded it into my car, and drove away without looking back. The dirt road felt longer on the way out than it did coming in. When I reached the main road, I stopped and told the property owner what I found. He looked tired when I explained, not shocked, like he had suspected someone might be using the land but didn't want to think about it. He said he would check it out, maybe call someone to clear the place. I didn't stay to hear what happened after. I just wanted to leave it behind. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up at night thinking about those slow steps in the grass. Not because I think it was anything supernatural, but because it was real. Someone was out there with me on that farm, moving around in the dark while I tried to sleep. Someone who didn't speak, didn't run, didn't try to scare me. Just watched, just waited. And knowing how close they were, how silent they stood beside my tent, still makes the back of my neck tighten. The ending was simple, but clear. I left as soon as I understood what the danger was. Another human, living hidden, moving barefoot in the dark. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person, and somehow that made it worse. I was 32 the year I went hunting alone in the northern woods of Alberta, far from the towns and far from anyone who could hear me if something went wrong. I had hunted before, but this time I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that sits so heavy on your ears you can hear your own heartbeat. That was the whole reason I drove 5 hours from Edmonton in my old truck and spent another hour on a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been touched by another vehicle in weeks. It was late October 2018, cold enough that the mornings felt like winter had already arrived. I reached a cutoff near a dry creek bed and stopped. The area was open enough for a tent, but surrounded by dark pines so tight they looked like walls. I set up camp near the tree line, laid out my gear, and checked my rifle 2 or 3 times more than I needed to. I liked routine. Routine kept me calm. The sun was dropping behind the trees by the time everything was ready, and the air kept getting colder, the kind of cold that crawls through your clothes before you even notice. The first night passed quietly. I walked around the nearby ridge early in the morning, hoping to see deer tracks, maybe moose prints if I was lucky. The frost was thick on the grass and made a crunching sound under my boots. The place felt untouched. No old fire rings, no boat marks, no beer cans or trash. It felt like I was the first human there in years. I liked that idea at the time. By noon, nothing had moved. No sound except wind brushing through the pines, and even that disappeared at times. It was strange how silent the place became. The kind of silence where you start to hear things that aren't there. I tried to ignore that feeling and kept walking deeper into the trees, marking my path with orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. Around mid-afternoon, I found something that made me stop. Along the soft mud near a slope, I saw prints, large, deep, too wide to be from a normal boot. They looked almost like boot prints, but the shape was off, like someone walked with a heavy limp or an uneven dragging step. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I crouched down to check them again. They didn't look like animal tracks, not like any tracks I knew. I told myself other hunters sometimes wandered through areas like this, even if it was rare. Still, the shape bothered me. One print was normal looking, the other almost twisted sideways, like the foot had been bent. It gave me a strange feeling I couldn't explain. I walked further and saw more of the same prints, spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them moved slow, stopping a lot. I followed them for a few minutes until they drifted off toward a steep area full of deadfall. I didn't want to climb through that mess, so I turned around and headed back to camp. The sun went down earlier than I expected. The temperature dropped fast, and the cold soaked into everything. I sat outside for a bit, eating from a metal can and listening. The woods felt wrong that night. I couldn't explain why, but something about the stillness bothered me. I tried to sleep early, but the wind picked up and the tent fabric kept shaking. Somewhere after midnight, I woke up to a faint sound, something soft and slow. Not the wind, not an animal moving through brush. This was a steady sound, like someone dragging their boots through leaves. I held my breath and tried to listen. The sound wasn't far. It moved around the edge of my camp, stopped for a moment, then continued again. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, trying to figure out if the noise was a deer, maybe a moose moving carefully. But the steps were too slow, too measured. Animals don't walk like that. They never move with that kind of steady dragging rhythm. The steps circled once, then faded away. I lay awake until dawn, every muscle tense. When light finally came, I stepped outside carefully, checking the ground. The frost made fresh prints stand out clearly. I almost wished I hadn't looked. The same strange tracks from yesterday circled my camp. One normal step, one twisted, dragging step. They came from the trees, looped close to my tent, then went back into the woods behind my camp. I felt a cold pressure in my chest when I saw them. This wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some hunter passing by. Whoever it was had come close on purpose. I packed some gear and walked in the direction the tracks went, keeping my rifle ready. The prints wandered between the trees, sometimes deep, sometimes faint, as if the person kept stopping or shifting weight. After about 100 meters, the tracks suddenly cut sideways, down a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. The path looked used, but only recently. The grass on it was bent and pressed down. I followed it only a short distance before deciding not to go further. Something felt off. The air felt colder on that path, and the trees around it grew too close together. I turned back, trying to stay calm. I told myself it was probably a lost hiker or someone passing through the area. Maybe someone who didn't want to be found. That wasn't comforting, but it was the only explanation I had. The day stayed dead silent. No birds, no crunch of animals breaking branches. The woods felt empty. That bothered me more than the prints. I've hunted long enough to know that when the woods go silent, something is wrong. That night I couldn't relax. I kept checking outside my tent, shining my flashlight at the trees. Each time the beam reached deep between the trunks, the darkness swallowed the light like it had weight. I kept hearing tiny sounds, little snaps, soft rustling, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just my nerves. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the dragging steps again. This time they were closer, slow, heavy. The way the dragging sound scraped across the ground made my stomach twist. I held my rifle and listened, breathing shallow and quiet. The steps stopped right behind my tent. No movement, no breathing, just stillness. Then something brushed the side of the tent, low to the ground, slow and careful. Not an animal, not the wind, something human. I felt a surge of panic rise in my throat. I didn't know whether to stay still or jump outside. I stayed frozen. After a long moment, the dragging steps moved again, heading toward the trees until they faded to nothing. At dawn, I came out and checked the ground again. The prints were there, clearer than before, fresh and sharp. No doubt someone had walked right up against the side of my tent. The twisted footprint dragged deeper, like the person had leaned more on that side. Whoever they were, they had been watching me, studying my camp, maybe waiting for something. I didn't stay another night. I packed fast, barely eating anything. As I loaded my gear, I heard something deep in the woods, a faint crack, like a branch breaking under slow weight. I didn't wait to see what it was. I drove out of the forest faster than I probably should have. Even when the trees cleared and I reached the main dirt road, I kept checking my mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. When I finally reached a gas station an hour later, the noise of cars and people talking felt strange, almost unreal. I stood there for a few minutes just listening to the normal sounds of life, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. I never went back to that area again. I don't know who was out there. I don't know why they watched my camp or why they walked the way they did. Maybe it was someone living out in the woods, someone who didn't want to be seen. Or maybe it was someone hiding from something. I still don't know. But the one thing that stayed with me the most was the last detail I noticed as I drove away. The prints that circled my camp had something strange about the twisted foot. The sole pattern didn't match any boot I knew. The normal foot had a regular tread, but the twisted one had almost no tread at all. It looked smooth, like a bare foot wrapped in something thin. That part bothered me more than anything else. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake at night thinking about those slow, dragging steps moving around my tent. And every time I go camping, no matter how peaceful the place looks, I sleep with one hand on my rifle and a light pointed at the tree line. Because out there in the woods, the scariest things are never monsters or ghosts. They're the people who choose to live where no one can see what they do. I had been wanting a quiet break from work for months, and by late October of 2016, I finally decided to take a long weekend and go camping alone in northern Arizona. I was 28 at the time, tired of the noise in Phoenix, and I thought a few days surrounded by tall pines and cold air would help clear my mind. I picked a spot near an old Forest Service road outside a small town called Pine Ridge, a place I had never been to before. The pictures online made it look peaceful. Wide open spaces, thick woods, and not many people around. That sounded perfect to me then. I drove up early in the morning, my old gray truck loaded with a basic tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water jugs, and a small cooler. The sun had just come up when I reached the dirt road. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frozen pine needles that crunched loudly under my boots when I stepped out. The air smelled fresh, cleaner than what I was used to in the city. My plan was simple. Set up camp, take a slow walk through the woods, cook something easy on my small stove, and spend the night away from everything. My campsite was a small clearing a little downhill from the road. The trees around it were tall and close together, dark on the edges where the light didn't reach. It felt private and safe at first. I pitched my tent near a fallen log and set up the rest of my things. For hours, nothing bothered me. The day passed quietly with me walking around, taking photos, and sitting on the log watching the wind move through the branches. The only sounds I heard were birds, the wind, and the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere deeper in the woods. When the sun started to drop, the temperature went down fast. I put on a thicker jacket and prepared a simple dinner. By the time I finished eating, the forest had gone completely dark. There were no other campers, no nearby houses, no car lights in the distance. Just total darkness except for my small fire. It was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. I sat for a while watching the flames until they burned low. Then I put them out, crawled into my tent, and pulled myself into my sleeping bag. I wasn't nervous yet. Everything still felt normal. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud at first. It was faint, slow steps on leaves. The kind of sound you make when you walk carefully, not wanting anyone to hear you. I lay still, my eyes open in the darkness. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe an elk. Those were common in the area, and the noise wasn't fast or aggressive. But something about the pattern of the steps felt wrong. They were too slow, too steady. They paused and resumed in a way that made my stomach tighten. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled the clearing, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see anything through the tent walls. I felt the cold air seeping through the thin fabric, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat. After a minute or two, the steps stopped completely. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. It felt like whatever was out there had stopped to listen, too. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I must have drifted back into a light sleep because the next time I woke up, it was because of a sharper sound, something snapping under weight. Not a small branch, a heavy one. This time the steps were closer, much closer. I could hear them right behind my tent, slow and deliberate. I froze inside my sleeping bag, barely breathing. The footsteps moved from one side of the tent to the other, slow enough that it made my hands numb from fear. I had my pocket knife in my bag, but gripping it didn't make me feel safer. The tent walls felt too thin, too weak, like anything could tear through them if it really wanted to. The steps stopped again, not far away, right outside. I tried to hold still, but my body was shaking. The cold didn't help. For several minutes, nothing moved. The forest around me was silent again, unnaturally silent. Felt like the entire place was waiting. When the steps finally started again, they moved away from the tent, fading back into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep after that. I sat awake until the first pale light came through the tent walls. When the sky brightened and the cold blue light turned to a weak yellow, I crawled out slowly, expecting to see nothing. but the soft ground around my tent told a different story. There were footprints in the pine needles, human footprints, clear and deep. They circled the entire tent, close enough that I could have touched whatever made them if I had reached my hand through the fabric. The prints weren't from boots. They looked like old sneakers with worn soles. The sight of them made my chest tighten in a way I can't explain. The size looked like they belonged to a grown adult, maybe a man. I looked around the clearing carefully. The woods were silent again, but not in the peaceful way they had been the day before. Now the silence felt heavy, like something was still watching from somewhere I couldn't see. The sun was barely up, but I knew I wasn't going to stay there another second. I packed my things fast, stuffing everything into the truck without caring how messy it was. Before driving off, I walked a few steps toward the tree line to look at the ground more closely. The footprints didn't just circle the tent. They came from the woods and went back into them, deeper into an area where the trees grew thicker and the light barely touched the ground. There were long drag marks in the dirt, like someone had pulled a stick or rope through the needles. I don't know why, but that detail bothered me more than anything else. On the drive back down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors even though I knew I was alone. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I got to the main highway and headed south toward Pine Ridge, I finally let myself breathe, but something still didn't feel right. I kept replaying the night in my head. The slow steps, the long pauses, the way the person never said a word, never made any sound except for footsteps. It felt like they had been studying me, watching me sleep from just a few feet away. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station to calm down. While I was filling the tank, I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. On the passenger side window, near the bottom corner of the glass, there were smudges. Long, thin smudges, like fingerprints dragged slowly downward. I hadn't touched that side of the truck before leaving. The prints weren't clear enough to see details, but the shape was unmistakable. Someone had touched my truck before I woke up and packed. They had been closer than I thought. I drove straight home without stopping again. For days afterward, I felt like someone was following me, even though I knew that was probably just fear sticking in my mind. I kept thinking about how quiet the person had been, how they never tried to talk, shout, or scare me. It felt like they had been waiting for something, maybe waiting to see if I would leave my tent or unzip it in the dark. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but they didn't find anything when they checked the area. They said it was probably a drifter, maybe someone living off the grid nearby. The forest was big enough for someone to hide for years without anyone knowing. That answer didn't calm me. In the end, nothing else happened. No one followed me home. No one came to my door. But the thought of those slow steps, circling me as I slept, stayed with me for a long time. I still hear them sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. The thin crunch of pine needles under careful feet. The long pauses. The feeling of being watched by someone who doesn't speak. I haven't camped alone since that night in 2016. I still love nature, but I learned something important out there in the cold, dark woods of northern Arizona. The scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters or anything from stories. The scariest things are real people who move quietly in the night, who don't need to say a word, who wait and watch from just beyond the edge of the light. I always liked being alone in the woods, but after what happened in the fall of 2019, I don't think I'll ever camp by myself again. I was 31 then, living in northern Colorado and working long hours in a small warehouse. The kind of shift work that drains your mind until quiet evenings in nature feel like the only way to breathe. I planned a simple 2-night trip in late September. Nothing dramatic, just a chance to get away. I picked a spot far from any campground, somewhere I wouldn't hear other people or see their lights. I drove out toward the edge of the Roosevelt National Forest, parked by a dirt pull-off, and walked nearly 2 miles uphill with my pack. The air felt cold enough to pinch my nose, and fallen leaves stuck to my boots with every step. I set up beside a thin line of pines with their needles spread across the ground like a brown blanket. The earth there was soft, and the ground sloped just enough that I had a view of a long stretch of trees below. I could hear a small creek running somewhere in the distance, low and steady. It was the kind of spot that made you feel totally cut off from the world, and that was exactly why I chose it. The first night was normal. I ate a simple meal I heated over a small stove, stretched out inside my tent, and stared at the faint glow of the sky through the mesh. The woods were quiet, only breaking every now and then with a crack of a branch or the dry rustle of animals moving through leaves. I slept lighter than usual because the cold kept pushing through the tent walls, but I still slept. When I woke the next morning, the sun was pale and slow to warm the air. I walked around the area, found a fallen log to sit on, and watched the treetops shift with the morning wind. Nothing felt wrong until late afternoon. It started with a feeling, the kind that hits without warning, like walking into a room and knowing someone has just left. I couldn't explain it. The trees looked the same, the quiet was the same, and the air smelled like cold pine and dirt like always. But something felt off, as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me after a long week of work. I kept busy, gathered some dry branches to burn later, ate early, and tried to relax. It didn't help much. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder. By the time the sky turned orange, the uneasy feeling had grown heavy. I kept hearing little snaps in the woods far behind my tent. Not big ones, just enough to make me freeze. I didn't see anything when I looked, just the long stretch of pines fading into shadow. I convinced myself it was deer or maybe squirrels hopping between branches. Around dusk, I decided to walk down toward the small creek to wash my hands and stretch my legs. I followed a narrow path between the trees, and that's when I noticed something strange. Off to my right, about 40 yards away, there was a dark shape standing between two thick pines. It wasn't moving, not at all. At first I thought it was a dead tree stump or a big rock, but the shape was too tall, too narrow. My throat tightened. I stood still and stared at it for nearly half a minute. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The shadow blended into the dimming woods, and after a while I forced myself to turn away. I told myself I imagined it. The creek water was colder than I expected. I dipped my hands and splashed my face, trying to shake off the nervousness that had been building inside me all day. When I started heading back toward my camp, I kept scanning the trees. The shape was gone. That didn't help my nerves. Night fell completely by the time my fire started burning. The flames were small, just enough to give off a glow, but every time they flickered, my shadow stretched long across the pine needles. I tried reading the old paperback I brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the edges of the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something watched me. Then the noises started again. Not the usual forest noises. These were soft steps, slow and careful, circling but never coming too close. It reminded me of someone pacing while trying not to be heard. I sat frozen with the book in my lap, staring past the firelight into the dark. My skin crawled from the top of my neck down my arms. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. When the steps eventually stopped, the silence that followed was worse. It felt like something had settled into a place where it could watch me without moving. My stomach turned with a deep, heavy dread that made it hard to breathe. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. I zipped it shut slowly, as if doing it quietly would matter. I lay on my sleeping bag staring at the ceiling, listening for every sound. I didn't even close my eyes at first. I kept my hand on the handle of the small camping knife I always carry. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. A single, sharp crack from the trees. Then another. Then something stepped closer, slow, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't a deer. Deer move light, scattered, unsure. This sounded like something tall shifting its weight as it stepped. I felt every hair on my body stand up. I held my breath and didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped right outside the edge of my camp. I could picture exactly where that was, just beyond where the fire embers glowed faintly. The sound of the wind died completely. I waited. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then something brushed against my tent. Not a paw, not something soft. It sounded like fingers dragging lightly across the fabric. My heart hammered in my throat. I tightened my grip on the knife and stayed perfectly still. The dragging stopped. Then one slow step shifted the ground. The dirt outside crunched like dry bones under weight. Another step. It circled the tent once, maybe twice. Couldn't even swallow. I could feel its presence through the thin fabric, like standing too close to a stranger in a dark hall. Then everything went still. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't sleep at all. At some point, the footsteps faded away, but I didn't trust it. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the faintest light to come through the tent. Only when I could see the shapes of the trees outside did I finally unzip the flap. The area around my camp looked the same, but the ground wasn't. Near the back of my tent, the pine needles were disturbed in a wide arc, like something had stood there for a long time. There were long impressions in the dirt too, not quite footprints, but close enough that I could see where weight had pressed down. They were larger than mine, longer, and there were marks on the side of my tent, a thin line where something had dragged slowly. I packed my things as fast as I ever have in my life. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I kept looking toward the trees, half expecting to see that tall shadow again. I didn't see it, but I heard something far off, a dry crack in the woods, like something moving away. On the hike back to my car, I felt watched the entire time. Every few minutes I turned around, sure I would see a shape standing between the pines. I never did, but the feeling stayed, following me all the way until I reached the dirt road. By the time I locked my car and started driving, my hands were trembling so hard I had to grip the wheel tighter just to keep straight. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone what I thought it was. I didn't want to explain marks in the dirt or why I felt hunted for a night. All I know is that something was out there with me. Something that moved like a person but didn't feel like one. Something that watched me for hours, creeping closer when it thought I was asleep. Whatever it was, it wanted to get close. It wanted to study me, and it didn't need to speak or show itself to make its presence clear. People use different names for things like that: skinwalker, mimic, watcher. But names don't matter much when you're alone in the dark and something is standing right outside your tent. All I know is that I left those woods at sunrise, and I've never gone back. I still think about it sometimes, usually late at night when the house is too quiet. I didn't see its face, I didn't hear it speak, and I didn't stay long enough to find out what it really wanted. But the feeling that followed me out of those trees, that cold, crawling awareness on the back of my neck, has never completely disappeared. And I'm sure of one thing: whatever I met that night was real. Not a ghost, not a story, not a trick of the mind. Real and watching. It was the summer of 2017, and I had finally managed to take a break from my job in Chicago. I was 28 at the time, a little burned out from the city grind, and I decided to head out west for some solo camping. I ended up in northern Idaho, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot National Forest. The forest was dense, with tall pines and firs stretching endlessly in every direction. I had read about a small, rarely used campsite near a creek, far from the main trails, and I thought it would be perfect for some quiet alone time. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was overcast, a heavy gray that made everything feel muted and damp. The air smelled earthy, mixed with the scent of wet pine needles. I carried a small backpack with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a compact stove, water, and a flashlight. I wanted to keep it light since I had to hike almost 2 miles from the nearest parking area. The first thing I noticed while setting up camp was how quiet it was. There were no birds singing, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the creek nearby sounded different, almost muffled by the thick mist rolling off the mountains. I set up my tent on a slight incline, hoping that the rain that the forecast had predicted wouldn't turn the ground to mud. By the time I had my tent pitched, the clouds had thickened, and a cold drizzle began to fall. The rain started slowly, just a soft tapping on the tent's rainfly, but it quickly became heavier. Soon, the entire forest was soaked in a gray haze, the branches dripping constantly, the ground slick and soft underfoot. I cooked a simple dinner of instant noodles on my small stove, trying to enjoy the sound of rain around me. There was something oddly comforting about the rhythmic patter on the tent, like the forest itself was breathing around me. Night fell quickly. In these remote areas, darkness is more complete than in any city. The rain had stopped in short bursts, then started again with sudden bursts of intensity. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, flashlight off, staring at the walls of my tent, listening to the storm. Around midnight, I started hearing it. A low, persistent thump coming from somewhere beyond the tent. At first, I thought it was a branch falling in the wind, or maybe a small animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound was deliberate, almost rhythmic, and it didn't match the random noises of the forest. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and visibility was almost zero. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, shadows flickering in the dim light. That's when I saw it. A figure or something that looked like a person, moving slowly along the treeline, just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet away, but I could see it distinctly enough to know it wasn't wearing bright colors. Everything was muted in dark clothing, drenched and blending into the shadows. I froze. My first thought was that it was another camper, but I quickly realized that no one else had access to this spot that night. It was far off any main trails, and I had been alone on the hike in. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on briefly, sweeping the beam toward the figure. The light caught on the glint of something metallic in their hand, a long, thin object that I couldn't identify. The figure froze for a moment and then vanished into the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, fueled by the rain and isolation. But then I heard the thumping again, closer this time, moving around the perimeter of my campsite. Something or someone was circling me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept my breathing as quiet as possible and crawled to the front of the tent to peek out again. The rain had reduced visibility, but I could make out vague shapes moving through the dark, wet trees. The thumping was accompanied now by a faint scraping sound, like boots dragging along wet soil. I realized I had to make a decision fast. Staying in the tent felt like a trap, but leaving into the darkness in the storm seemed even worse. I remembered the creek nearby. It ran downhill and would lead to a larger trail if I followed it. I decided to wait until the figure moved away, then make a run for it. I stayed as still as possible, pretending to be asleep, listening as the steps circled slowly around the camp. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. My flashlight was off to avoid attracting attention, and I had nothing but my backpack and a small pocket knife. At around 3 a.m., the rain lessened to a drizzle, and I noticed the sounds moving away, heading back into the forest. I didn't wait to confirm. I unzipped my tent silently, grabbed my backpack, and slipped into the darkness along the edge of the creek. My feet sank into mud and wet leaves, but I kept moving, following the sound of running water. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I forced myself to stay calm, keeping the creek to my left as a guide. I walked for nearly an hour, mud soaking through my shoes, my clothes heavy with rain, my body trembling from cold and fear. The forest began to thin slightly, and faint moonlight filtered through the clouds. Finally, I saw a dim glow ahead. It was a ranger's cabin I had seen marked on the map earlier. Relief hit me like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I approached slowly, not sure if I'd be seen, but as I got closer, a porch light flicked on, and a figure stepped out. I explained my situation quickly, soaked and shivering. The ranger radioed for assistance and offered me a warm place to rest for the night. By dawn, the storm had fully passed. The forest looked calm, almost serene, as if nothing had happened. I watched from the cabin's porch, sipping a cup of hot coffee, reflecting on the night. Whatever had been circling my camp had vanished, leaving only mud prints and broken branches in its wake. Later, I learned from the ranger that there had been reports of poachers operating in the area, targeting remote campsites and hikers. That metallic glint I had seen, it was probably a weapon or a tool, and I realized how close I had come to real danger. I spent the next day hiking back to the main road with the ranger, my nerves still on edge. Even in daylight, the forest felt different, alive in a way that was unsettling. When I finally reached my car, soaked and exhausted, I felt a profound relief. That night in the forest, alone, in the rain, had tested me in ways I hadn't expected. It left me with a new respect for isolation, for nature's raw unpredictability, and for how careful one has to be when venturing into the wilderness. Even years later, whenever I think about that night, I remember the smell of wet pine, the sound of relentless rain, the cold mud under my hands and feet, and the figure that disappeared into the dark. But I also remember the feeling of survival, the relief of finding safety, and the clarity of knowing that sometimes the forest holds real danger, and sometimes your own quick thinking and caution is what keeps you alive. I was 31 the year I decided to camp alone in the mountains near northern Idaho. It was early September of 2019, the kind of time when the air feels like summer during the day but drops fast the moment the sun sinks. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, barely stepping outside, and I convinced myself that a quiet weekend in the woods would fix something inside me. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, and enough food for 2 days. I chose a place far from the usual trails, a clearing beside an old logging road that hardly anyone used anymore. I liked the idea of being alone, or at least I thought I did. The drive into the hills took longer than I planned because the road turned rough near the end. Loose rocks clattered under the tires, and branches scraped the side of my truck. When I stepped out, the silence hit me first. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of stillness that almost feels heavy, as if the whole forest is holding its breath. The clearing was wide, maybe 40 yards across, with tall pines around it that blocked most of the sky. I could smell sap and dry needles and the faint scent of cold earth. I set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find. The ground was covered in soft brown needles that cushioned each step. I dropped my pack against a fallen tree and walked around the area to get familiar with it. The forest looked normal enough, just miles of trees and dark undergrowth, but there was something strange about how untouched it seemed. No trash, no footprints, no sign of anyone having camped there in a long time. I liked that at first, thinking I had found the perfect place. The first few hours passed slowly. I cooked a small meal as the sun went down, the sky turning from pale blue to a dull orange behind the treetops. As darkness crept in, I noticed how cold it got. The wind picked up and moved through the branches like a slow breath. By the time I crawled inside my tent, the temperature felt like late autumn, and the air smelled sharper, almost metallic. I lay on my back for a long time, listening to the forest. It wasn't silent anymore. I could hear the soft clicking of insects, the distant rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. All of it sounded normal enough until I realized something odd. None of the noises came close. Everything stayed far out, like the entire forest kept its distance from my campsite. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that was much closer. Something moved in the clearing. Not a quick movement like a small animal, and not the confident steps of a large one either. It was slow, uneven, like someone taking careful steps through the needles. I lay completely still, breathing shallow. The walls of my tent felt paper thin. The sound moved around the edge of the clearing, staying just out of sight. I could hear each step clearly. Soft crunch. Pause. Soft crunch again. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe even an elk. But the rhythm was wrong. Animals in the wild don't move like that. They move with more intention, faster, without those strange delays between each step. The thing out there seemed to be listening, thinking, adjusting. It circled once. Then the steps faded until I could no longer hear them. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. When I finally drifted off, the sky was already turning gray. In the morning, I checked the ground around the clearing. There were marks, but not clear ones, just scattered disturbances in the needles. No prints deep enough to identify, and too messed up to tell what direction anything came from. I tried to shake off the unease, blaming it on how tired I was. I cooked breakfast, walked around the forest, tried to convince myself everything was normal. But I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see something standing between the trunks. That afternoon, clouds rolled in thick and gray. The temperature dropped again. I gathered more firewood, filling my arms until they ached. The clearing felt smaller than before, like the trees had leaned in closer. I kept hearing distant sounds, soft cracks, low thumps, but every time I turned my head, everything looked still. Near evening, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand straight. Behind my tent, maybe 15 feet into the trees, I found a tree trunk with fresh scrape marks. The bark was peeled off in long strips about the height of my chest. The edges of each strip were clean, as if cut with something sharp. But there were no tool marks, no jagged edges like an axe might leave, no sign of claws, just smooth, peeled bark. I stood there staring at it for a long time, feeling the cold seep deeper into my chest. I didn't know what made the marks, but I didn't like the idea of being the only person in an empty forest with something that did that. As night fell, I built a larger fire than the night before. Flames cracked loudly and threw long shadows across the clearing. I kept my flashlight beside me even though the batteries were low. I sat near the fire until late, staring into the dark trees. The forest felt alive, but not in a good way. Felt like it was watching. Started again around 1 a.m. I heard the same slow steps in the needles, coming from the same direction as last night. This time they were closer. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I lay flat in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, the cold fabric brushing against my face. The steps stopped right outside the tent. Not on the side, not near the entrance. Right at the back, as if something stood inches away from my head. I could hear the faintest sound, like cloth brushing against bark. Something shifted its weight. The tent fabric didn't move, but I felt its presence. Heavy, patient, deliberate. It stayed there for what felt like minutes. Then I heard it walk away, but not back into the forest. It moved slowly across the clearing, passing the fire pit where the ashes still held a faint red glow. The steps were light, almost careful. I kept expecting them to fade, but they didn't. They went to the far side of the clearing and stopped again. When the silence returned, it felt worse than the footsteps. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. My nerves were shredded, and the feeling of being watched had burrowed deep. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my truck without caring about order. The air felt frozen and heavy, like the forest didn't want me moving too fast. Before leaving, I walked one last circle around the clearing just to make sure I didn't forget anything. That's when I found something I hadn't seen earlier. Near the tree line, right across from where my tent had been, the needles looked pressed down in a long, narrow shape. It wasn't a footprint. It looked more like a place where someone had knelt for a long time. The depression was almost the length of a person, as if something lay flat on the ground, staring toward my tent. I felt sick when I realized it lined up perfectly with where my head had been while I slept. I didn't stay another minute. I got in my truck and drove down the rough road faster than I should have. The trees seemed to crowd the sides of the path, and every shadow felt too deep. Even when I reached the main road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something step out behind me. I didn't stop until I reached town. Only when I heard the noise of cars and saw people walking around did the tension finally ease enough for me to breathe normally again. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in my house felt like a step outside my window. I kept thinking about that long, pressed-down shape in the needles, the scrape marks on the tree trunk, the slow steps circling my tent. I knew it wasn't a ghost or some storybook creature. Whatever it was real. Someone had been there with me. Someone who didn't make a sound except for those slow steps. Someone who watched me sleep from only a few feet away. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was knowing that I never heard them arrive, and I never heard them leave. I didn't scare them off. They left because they wanted to, and that, more than anything, made me realize how lucky I was to wake up at all. I haven't camped alone since then. I don't think I ever will again. I was 28, traveling solo through Europe, and after a few days of city hopping, I found myself in a remote corner of Austria. The plan was simple. Camp for a couple of days to clear my mind, disconnect from the digital world, and just be out in nature. I'd found this small camping site on a map, tucked between the rolling hills of the Alps, near a little village called Kitzbühel. The area seemed serene, untouched by the chaos of modern life. When I arrived at the site, it was perfect. There were only a handful of campers, and the space was wide open with tall pines surrounding the area. The air was fresh, the kind that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. I pitched my tent near the edge of the woods, not far from a bubbling stream that I could hear faintly in the distance. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting a soft golden glow across the landscape. As evening approached, I made a small campfire, cooked up a simple meal, and leaned back to enjoy the crackling of the flames. There was something peaceful about the stillness of the place. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the far-off call of a bird. I felt like I was the only person in the world. But then, as the night crept in and the sky darkened, something shifted. I just finished eating and was sitting back, staring into the fire, when I heard footsteps. They weren't far off, and they were slow, deliberate. I thought at first it might just be another camper, maybe out for a late-night stroll. The sound was coming from the path that led deeper into the woods, not far from my tent. I waited, thinking they would pass, but the footsteps stopped. I stood up, looking around, trying to make sense of the situation. There was no one in sight. My heart started to race, but I chalked it up to the isolation. It was quiet, too quiet almost. The usual night sounds of animals had gone silent. The only noise was my own breath, shallow now, as I strained to hear. Suddenly, from behind the trees, a figure appeared. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and dressed in dark clothing, something like a long coat. The man didn't move at first, just stood there, staring at me. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out his broad shoulders and a strange, still posture. He didn't seem to be making any effort to be discreet. He just stood there. I called out, half expecting him to be someone lost or a hiker in need of directions, but he didn't respond. The way he stood, unmoving, unnerved me. There was something off about him. I could feel my stomach tighten, an instinctive unease creeping up my spine. I turned my back to the fire, thinking maybe he would just walk away if I ignored him. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in his direction, hoping the beam would break the tension, give me some clarity. The light flickered briefly before illuminating his face. He had sharp features, a gaunt face, with pale skin that looked almost sickly under the glow of the light. His eyes were wide open, but there was no emotion in them. No warmth, no curiosity, just an eerie, unsettling blankness. I froze. For a moment, it felt like everything was holding its breath, like the entire forest had gone still, waiting. I was struck by how unnatural it all seemed. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood there, watching me. My heartbeat was thundering in my chest now. I tried to speak again, but my throat had gone dry. The man took a step forward, then another. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I backed away slowly, stumbling over the ground, keeping the light fixed on him. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about his presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong here, in this peaceful, isolated place. As I moved toward my tent, I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away. I felt trapped. The man took another step, and this time he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's getting late," he said, his accent thick, but his tone was odd. It didn't have the warmth you would expect from someone out here in the woods at night. It was flat, mechanical, like he wasn't speaking to me but rather through me. I didn't respond, couldn't. I just kept backing away, my mind racing through all the possible outcomes, none of which seemed good. Suddenly, the man moved faster, closing the distance between us with a speed that didn't match his earlier slow, deliberate pace. I bolted. I ran through the trees, not caring which direction I was going, just as long as I was away from him. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as I pushed myself through the brush, dodging branches that whipped at my face. I didn't look back, too afraid to see what might be coming after me. I ran for what felt like miles, but after a while, I realized I had no idea where I was. The landscape had changed. The tall pines had given way to dense thickets, and the ground was uneven, full of rocks and roots. My breath came in gasps, my panic rising as I realized I was lost. That's when I heard him again. His footsteps were behind me, close now, too close. I couldn't tell how he was moving so fast, but he was there, just behind me, gaining ground. I stumbled, my feet catching on something, and I fell hard onto the ground, scraping my knees and palms. I scrambled to get up, my heart racing, and turned to face the direction I thought I'd come from. The woods were silent again. No footsteps, no voice. I stood there, frozen for a long moment, waiting for something, anything. The forest seemed to breathe around me, the wind picking up in the trees, rustling the leaves. Then I heard it, his voice softer now, as if he were speaking to himself. "You're safe for now, but you won't be for long," he said. Then the silence returned. I don't know how much time passed before I finally found my bearings, but when I did, I started running again, this time without stopping. Eventually, I stumbled upon a narrow trail that led me out of the woods and into a clearing. I didn't stop to look around, didn't stop to breathe, just kept moving. I didn't see the man again, but I swear I could feel his eyes on me, watching me, even after I made it back to civilization. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed, that he was still out there, waiting. Even now, weeks later, I still can't get the image of his face out of my head. I don't know who he was or why he was there, but I know one thing for sure. There are some people, some things that just don't belong in the woods, and I'll never camp alone in Austria again. I spent most of the summer of 2019 traveling across small towns in northern Idaho, trying to take a break from my normal life and clear my head. I was 27 at the time, tired of the noise of the city, tired of early alarms, tired of working late nights in a warehouse that smelled like burnt plastic. I had saved enough money to take a few weeks off, so I bought a used pickup truck, packed a tent, some tools, a first aid kit, a small cooler, and a sleeping bag that looked like it had survived a whole decade of camping trips before me. I told myself I would camp anywhere that felt quiet. No crowded sites, no fancy parks, just open spaces that looked peaceful. One afternoon, while driving along a long empty road that cut through wide fields, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a leaning fence. The paint was fading, but the words were still clear enough. Overnight camping allowed use at your own risk. There was an arrow pointing left into a dirt path that led between two rows of dying corn stalks. The place looked abandoned, the kind of land no one cared about anymore. I thought it was perfect. I wanted quiet, and the emptiness of that farm looked like it had more quiet than I could ever ask for. The dirt path was rough enough to make the whole truck rattle, the tires kicking up light brown dust that hung in the air behind me like smoke. I drove slowly until the cornfields opened into a flat stretch of land with a rusty tractor, a collapsed shed, and tall grass that moved gently with the wind. The sun was still an hour or two from setting, so I parked near the edge of the field and walked around to check the area. The air smelled like dry soil and old grain. There were no houses close by, no sounds of animals, not even birds. It felt like the whole place had been frozen and forgotten. I set my tent near a small grouping of cottonwood trees, the only shade available. The ground felt uneven beneath the tarp, but firm enough to sleep on. I gathered a few dry branches and set up a small fire pit, though I planned to keep the fire small since the fields were dry. I heated up a can of soup on a little metal stove. The wind kept blowing ash around, and every breath tasted a bit like smoke. The sky slowly turned orange, then reddish, then darker as thin clouds rolled in. By the time the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. Farms look warm and harmless during the day, but at night everything changes. The fields become wide, shadowy seas. The rows of crops look like walls hiding something, and even the smallest rustle of grass sounds like footsteps. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just dry leaves moving, nothing else. I put out the fire before it got too dark and crawled into my tent. The quiet was so heavy it almost felt like a sound of its own. I lay still, listening to the faint ring in my ears that always came when everything around me went completely silent. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise that I couldn't understand at first. It was faint, like something tapping lightly against the ground. I thought maybe it was an animal stepping on dry stalks, but the sound didn't move. It stayed in the same spot. Steady, slow tap, then another, then nothing, then another tap. The longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the sound of an animal. It wasn't heavy enough to be a deer or a cow. It wasn't fast enough to be a rodent or something running. It sounded like something being lightly dropped onto the dirt, over and over again, with long pauses in between. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself things outdoors make strange noises at night, especially on old farms. But my body didn't believe that. My chest felt tight, and I kept swallowing even though my mouth was dry. When the tapping stopped for a long moment, I felt a small wave of relief. I closed my eyes again, trying to fall asleep. But just when I felt myself drifting, a new sound started. Footsteps. Not fast, not running, not rushing toward the tent. Just slow, steady steps, each one pressing into the ground with weight. Too heavy to be an animal, too slow and careful to be random. My body froze. I lay flat on my sleeping bag, barely breathing, listening as the steps came from the direction of the cornfield and stopped somewhere near my truck. A long stretch of silence followed. Then I heard a metal clinking sound, a gentle rattle, like someone touching the handle of the truck's door. Not pulling it, not forcing it, just touching it. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't move. I didn't even dare shift my weight. The cold air inside the tent felt even colder, and my hands were starting to shake. Whoever was out there didn't open anything. They just stood near the truck. I didn't hear breathing, but I could feel the presence, that heavy awareness that someone was outside. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, moving toward the back of the truck, then toward the edge of the trees, then toward the old shed that was half collapsed. The person, or whatever it was, stayed hidden in the darkness, and I stayed inside my tent feeling trapped. All I could do was wait. For hours, I heard faint movements across the field. Sometimes it was grass shifting, sometimes something metal gently knocking, sometimes distant steps that sounded like they were circling. I never heard a voice or anything human, just the sounds of someone slowly walking around the farm with no clear purpose. I kept asking myself if this was someone who owned the land and was checking on me, but nothing felt normal about it. No one checks their property at 2 in the morning by walking silently around someone's campsite. Just before dawn, the sounds finally stopped. The sky grew pale blue, then a bit brighter. When I finally felt safe enough to unzip the tent, the morning air hit me like a bucket of cold water. The ground was covered in thin patches of dew, and the fields looked dull and lifeless. I walked toward my truck and stopped when I noticed something on the ground. Small pieces of dirt were gathered in a neat stack right next to the passenger door. Someone had scooped little clumps from the field and placed them there in a careful pile. Not scattered, not random, placed. The sight of it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a prank a kid would pull. It wasn't something an animal could do. It was something deliberate, quiet, and strange. And whoever did it had been only a foot or two away from my tent for hours. I didn't pack slowly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into the truck without care, shaking the entire time. I kept looking at the cornfield, expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty, open, and still. That somehow made it worse. When I finally drove off the farm, the morning sun was just touching the tops of the corn stalks. The dirt road seemed longer than before, each bump making me grip the wheel harder. Only when I got back onto the paved highway did I feel myself breathe normally again. I didn't report anything. I didn't tell anyone I knew. It felt like one of those experiences that people would shrug off or laugh about, and I didn't want to hear someone say I imagined it. I knew what I heard. I knew someone was out there walking around my tent for hours with no explanation. I knew someone touched my truck and left that strange pile of dirt. I didn't need anyone else to tell me whether it was real. For the rest of that trip, I avoided farms completely. I stayed near lakes, near forests, near established campgrounds where other people were close by. I never camped alone on empty farmland again. Even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. I will never know who was out there, or what they were doing, or why they moved so slowly in the dark. But I know this: it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a person walking through that dry, forgotten farm in the middle of the night, watching everything in silence, and leaving before sunrise without ever being seen. I picked a spot deep inside the Sawtooth Range in Idaho in late September of 2017. I had chosen this place because it wasn't popular, and I wanted silence. I was 26 at the time and thought I knew enough about the woods to be comfortable alone. The long dirt road I followed felt endless, and each mile put me farther away from cell signal, houses, or any sense of normal life. When I finally reached a small pull-off near a narrow trailhead, the sun was low, burning orange behind the jagged peaks. I parked, stepped out, and felt that strange mix of freedom and unease that always comes when nothing man-made is close by. The air was cold in that dry, high-altitude way that makes your breath feel thin. Pine needles cracked under my boots as I carried my pack and rifled deeper into the forest, following the narrow trail that cut between tall trees. I wasn't hunting anything specific. I just wanted quiet, maybe a chance to see some elk from a distance. The trail was faint, barely used, and within 20 minutes I could no longer hear the faint hum of the world I had left behind. I found a flat section beside a small slope where the ground was soft with old pine needles. The spot wasn't perfect, but it felt tucked away. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes down, and gathered wood before darkness came. By the time the last light drained away, the woods around me felt heavier, thicker. The trees cast long black shapes that blended together until everything felt like one giant dark wall. I started my fire and sat close, watching sparks drift upward and disappear. Trips like this always come with a moment where silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling loud. That moment came when the fire settled into slow, glowing coals. I could hear my own heartbeat because nothing else around me made sound. No birds, no wind, no snapping branches. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something is waiting for you to let your guard down. I cooked a simple meal, ate, cleaned up, and crawled into my tent. I lay on my back and listened. The cold crept in slowly, climbing through the fabric of the tent until my breath made small clouds in the dark. Eventually sleep came, the light and restless kind that comes from being alone in an unfamiliar place. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. There was no reason for it, no noise, no dream I remembered. Just that sudden shift from sleep to being wide awake. The air felt colder than before, almost damp. I tried to slow my breathing, tried to quiet the rising tension. I listened for anything. A small drop of water hit the tent, then another. It wasn't rain, just the leftover moisture falling from the branches above. But under that quiet pattern, I heard something else. It was faint, spaced out, barely a sound at first. A soft crunch, then nothing. Another crunch, then silence again. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal moving naturally through brush. It sounded like steps. Slow, careful steps, the kind made by someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the sleeping bag. I didn't reach for anything. I just listened. My heartbeat got so loud I felt the tent shake with it. The steps came closer, but never fast, never aggressive. Just steady and slow, like someone walking small circles near my camp but not entering it fully. I waited for the smell of an animal, or the snort of a deer, or the heavy shifting weight of a bear. But there was none of that. The air smelled like dirt and pine. The steps were too even to be an animal. They stopped once, so close to the tent that I expected a shadow to pass over the fabric. But there was nothing. Minutes passed. Then the steps moved away, slow again, fading until I was alone with the sound of dripping branches. I didn't sleep again. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside with stiff legs and a dry mouth. The cold morning air hit hard. Everything looked untouched: fire pit, gear, the area around the tent. But the pine needles just past the campsite were disturbed. A narrow trail of faint impressions moved in a slow arc around where I had slept. They weren't clear footprints, but they weren't animal tracks either. They looked like someone lightly pressing the ground with a boot, but not putting their full weight down. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer moving strangely. Maybe my imagination filling in blanks during the night. But the feeling in my chest didn't match those excuses. Something had stood close to me while I slept, and it had done it with intention. I spent the day hiking deeper into the trees, trying to clear my mind, but every time I stopped to drink water or rest, I felt watched. I would look up expecting to see a shape between the trees. Nothing was there, but the feeling stayed. By late afternoon, clouds gathered and covered the sky. The air turned colder and still. I decided I would pack up early the next morning and head back. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. That night, after the fire burned down again, I lay in my tent fully awake. I kept my rifle beside me, not out of panic but out of caution. The forest stayed quiet for hours. No steps, no animals, no dripping branches. Around maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, something hit the ground outside my tent. It was small, light, and quick. Then another. I thought at first maybe pine cones were falling. But then another came, and another, all hitting within a tight area, not scattered like natural fall. I opened my eyes wide in the dark. Something small hit the tent fabric above my feet, then at my side, then near my head. Tiny taps, soft but intentional. Pine cones didn't fall like that, especially not at night when the air had gone dead still. I held my breath until I felt dizzy. More taps came, spaced out, almost like someone tossing small pebbles or nuts at the tent to test if I was awake. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I kept my breathing slow and steady, pretending I was asleep. After a long stretch of complete silence, I heard those same slow, careful steps again. They circled the tent the same way as the night before. Not close enough to touch the fabric, but close enough that I felt the weight of each step through the ground. The steps stopped behind me, on the side where the slope dropped sharply. They stayed there for what felt like forever. I didn't know if whoever or whatever it was could hear my heartbeat. I tried to keep my breathing calm. My entire body felt frozen. At some point, the steps retreated again. Slow, measured, patient. The forest went silent afterward. I kept my eyes open until the sky started to lighten. I didn't waste time packing. I tore down the tent, stuffed everything in the backpack, and got moving. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone standing among the trees, but I saw nothing except the long, empty trail. The silence stayed with me the entire walk back. When I reached the dirt road, my truck looked exactly the same as I had left it. But when I walked around to put my pack in the bed, I noticed something on the tailgate. A thin smear of dirt, drawn by a finger in one slow line down the metal. Not words, not a symbol, just a single dragging mark, like someone had touched the tailgate lightly and pulled their hand down. It wasn't there when I arrived the day before. I was sure of that. I drove out of the forest without stopping, without looking back into the trees. Even as the sunlight broke through the clouds and marked the end of the night, I didn't feel relief. The whole drive, I kept imagining someone standing just inside the tree line, watching me leave, waiting to see if I would ever come back. I never did return to that part of Idaho, and I don't camp alone anymore. It wasn't fear of animals or storms or getting lost. It was the clear, cold realization that someone had watched me for 2 nights straight with patience that felt far from normal. Whoever they were, they stayed quiet, stayed hidden, stayed close, and chose not to reveal themselves. That choice alone made it worse because it meant they had control the entire time, and I had none. I went out on a late autumn hunting trip in northern Montana back in 2019. I was 27 at the time and still trying to feel confident doing these things alone. I had camped solo before, but never deep in the wooded hills on the edge of the Flathead region. A coworker had told me about a quiet patch of land near old logging roads where people rarely went anymore. He said the deer were good there, and that the area stayed empty because most hunters preferred the open valleys. I liked the idea of being alone in a place where I wouldn't hear trucks or see headlights cutting between the trees. I arrived just after noon, parked my old truck in a clearing, and walked half a mile with my pack until I found a flat spot between two tall pines. The air felt sharp but dry, and the ground was covered in a mix of dead needles and pale grass. I set up my tent, stored my food in a dry bag, and hung it using a rope I always kept in the truck. The sky had that pale, washed-out color that happens before the sun drops behind the hills. I could already feel the temperature sinking, but I didn't mind. Cold made me feel alert. After setting camp, I walked the old logging trail with my rifle resting against my shoulder. The woods were quiet in a heavy way, like everything was waiting. I spotted fresh tracks, probably a deer that had passed earlier that morning. The prints pointed downslope, so I followed them for a while until they faded into a patch of thick brush. I stayed out until the light dimmed enough that the air around me turned blue. I didn't want to get stuck stumbling back in the dark, so I returned to camp. I made a small fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the crackling of the wood. The first strange thing happened that night. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that made me freeze or panic. It was just a small thing that didn't feel right. I heard a single stick snap somewhere beyond the firelight. I wasn't new to the woods, so I knew animals move at night. Sometimes a deer steps on something hard, sometimes a fox rustles dead leaves. But this crack felt deliberate, like the weight on it had been slow. I waited, looking into the shadows, expecting to see eyes reflecting the fire. I saw nothing. The woods stayed dark, steady, and silent. Eventually, the cold pushed me into my tent. I slept lightly. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up sweating even though the air was bitter cold. I didn't know why I felt so unsettled. Nothing had touched the tent. Nothing was moving outside. It was just that odd heavy silence again, the kind where the woods hold their breath. I stayed awake for almost an hour before drifting off. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed a small thing that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The rope I had tied my food bag onto was slightly lower, maybe 2 inches lower than the knot I remembered tying. The branch it hung from was thick and didn't bend easily. The knot was still tight, so maybe the bag had shifted or maybe I had tied it wrong. I tried to brush it off, but it sat in the back of my mind as I packed for the day's hunt. I followed the ridge above my camp for almost 2 miles. I saw fresh tracks, caught glimpses of movement, but nothing close enough to take a clean shot. By noon, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen log, ate a protein bar, and looked out at the hills layered in soft blue haze. It felt calming in a way I needed after the restless night. When I returned to camp around late afternoon, the air had grown colder and the sky looked heavier. The fire pit was exactly how I left it. My gear lay where I'd placed it. Nothing seemed wrong until I checked my tent. The zipper was sitting 2 or 3 inches open at the bottom. I knew I had closed it all the way before leaving. I always did. I didn't store food inside, so animals had no reason to paw at it. There were no claw marks, no tears. It looked like someone had simply undone it partway and then left it like that. My stomach felt tight. I looked around the woods slowly, checking every tree, every shape between the branches. Nothing moved. I told myself I had probably rushed out in the morning and forgot to zip it. But even while thinking that, I didn't believe it. As the sun dropped, I made a slightly larger fire than the night before and cooked my meal. I kept checking behind me, listening for steps, listening for breathing, listening for anything. The woods reacted like they always did, wind pushing branches, squirrels hopping somewhere far away, the faint distant noise of an owl. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, but the feeling stayed. That night I didn't sleep as easily. I lay inside my tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric above me. The cold air made the nylon feel stiff against the wind. I tried to slow my breathing. For a while, everything stayed calm. Then, Sometime after midnight, I felt a very light vibration in the ground. It was faint, almost like someone had taken a single slow step nearby, then another, each one spaced far apart. Each one soft but heavy enough that I felt it through the earth rather than heard it with my ears. I didn't move. My heart was hitting my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps stopped. The silence that followed felt too thick. I forced myself to breathe normally, counting each breath, waiting for anything to happen. After maybe 15 minutes, the tension in the ground slowly drifted away. I waited another long time before finally drifting into a shallow, miserable sleep. At dawn, I stepped outside with stiff legs and a stiff back. Everything looked normal, but as soon as I walked toward the fire pit, I noticed the footprints. Not animal prints.
Bootprints.
A single set, hard to see unless the light hit them just right. They circled around the area where I kept my gear. They came from the treeline, looped once around the fire pit, stopped a few feet from my tent, and then returned toward the woods. Whoever it was had stood close enough to the tent to leave visible marks. My hands felt cold even though the sunlight hit them. I walked in a full circle around camp, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing watched me, at least nothing I could see. I didn't stay long. I packed my things quickly, tossing everything into my bags without caring about order. I wanted to get out before the person behind those footprints came back. I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder, even while stuffing things into the truck bed. The air felt wrong in a way I still can't fully explain. It felt like the woods were pressing in, like the trees held something unseen between them. When I finally got into the driver's seat, the relief was so strong that I felt a sharp headache behind my eyes. I turned the key, backed out of the clearing, and drove until the dirt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to paved road. About 30 minutes later, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town named Waverly Ridge. I stretched my legs, bought a bottle of water, and tried to calm down. My heart rate slowed enough that I could think clearly. I realized then that leaving had been the right decision. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nobody tried to grab me or attack me, but the signs were clear. Someone had been in my camp at night, close to my tent, close enough to look at everything I had without waking me. Someone had unzipped my tent earlier in the day. Someone had walked around my camp while I slept. Whoever it was had kept a distance, but not a safe one. There was no reason to stay out there and wait for whatever they wanted. I never reported it because I didn't have anything concrete to give. No face, no name, no confrontation. Just footprints and a knot tied lower than I remembered and a half-unzipped tent. People at the station would have chalked it up to nerves. Friends would have said I imagined most of it. Maybe they would be right. Maybe the prints were old. Maybe the knot slipped on its own. Maybe I had forgotten to close the tent all the way. Maybe the ground vibration was an animal I didn't recognize. But there is something I cannot forget. That feeling that someone stood near me while I slept. That sense of being watched in the cold, dark woods without knowing from where. That knowledge that if I had woken up at the wrong moment, I might have seen a shape silently standing outside the thin fabric of my tent. I still go camping, but I don't camp alone anymore. And I don't return to places where the trees grow too close or the trails disappear too quickly. Some spaces in the wild feel untouched for a reason. And I learned that when something feels wrong out there, you don't wait for proof. You leave before the proof shows itself. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a quiet weekend alone in the mountains of northern Spain in late September of 2019. I had been working long hours that whole month, barely sleeping, barely relaxing, and I felt like the noise of my life was getting too loud. I wanted to disappear into nature for a couple of days, away from people, away from phones, away from everything. I picked a remote trail that wasn't very popular. a place where I knew I could hike for hours without seeing another person. The forecast said the weather would stay dry and slightly cool, so it seemed perfect. I parked my car near a narrow gravel road that cut between tall pine trees. The forest was thick and dark, the kind where the sunlight breaks into thin stripes on the ground. I packed only what I needed: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooking pot, a flashlight, a knife, and enough food and water for 2 nights. The trailhead was almost silent except for wind pushing through the trees. I remember feeling calm, like I had finally stepped out of the pressure of everyday life. The first few hours of hiking were easy. The trail sloped slowly upward, weaving through huge moss-covered rocks. Fallen leaves made a soft, crunchy layer under my boots. The air smelled like resin and cold soil. As I moved deeper into the forest, the sounds became quieter. Even the birds seemed far away. By late afternoon, the light had that warm orange tone that comes before dusk. I found a small flat clearing between 2 massive boulders and decided it was the perfect place to set up camp. The clearing felt sheltered from wind, and the ground was surprisingly soft. I pitched my tent, tightened the ropes, and made sure everything was secured. After that, I walked a short distance to gather some dry branches for a small cooking fire. The ground was scattered with needles and broken sticks. I cooked a simple meal and ate slowly while listening to the forest settling into night. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I could hear the distant echo of water somewhere, maybe a stream or a small river. Once the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped sharply. I put on an extra jacket and sat outside for a bit, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The clouds were moving fast, covering the stars now and then. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. When the cold became too much, I climbed into my tent, zipped the entrance, and lay back on my sleeping bag. For a while, everything felt perfect. The air was cool, the ground was firm, and my body felt heavy and relaxed. But somewhere around midnight, something changed. I woke up abruptly, not from a dream, but from a sound. At first, I didn't know what it was. The forest had its usual background noise of wind and leaves, but this sound was different. It was faint, but steady, like slow footsteps crushing dried leaves. I lay completely still, listening. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears. The footsteps were not constant. They came in short bursts with long pauses in between, like someone stopping, then moving again. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. Deer were common in these areas, wild boars too, but the rhythm of the steps felt wrong for an animal. They sounded too measured, too careful, as if the thing, whatever it was, did not want to be heard. The steps came closer, stopping just past one of the big boulders. My tent was positioned so the entrance faced the open part of the clearing, while the boulders stood behind me. That meant whatever was approaching was on the far side of the tent, hidden from my view. I held my breath, waiting for another sound. For a solid minute, there was only silence. Then I heard the slightest crunch, right next to the fabric of the tent. It was so close that I felt the vibration more than I actually heard it. Something was standing just outside. My first instinct was to reach for my knife, which I had placed near my backpack. But I didn't move. I was afraid any sound I made would alert whatever was outside. Another slow step. The shape of the tent wall changed. Something brushed against it lightly, pressing the fabric inward about an inch before pulling away. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might pass out. I stared at that small bulge in the fabric, waiting for it to appear again. I wanted to yell, to scare it away, but the words wouldn't come out. The fear felt thick in my throat. After another long moment, the brushing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow and heavy, like the person or animal was carefully checking the area. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard nothing. No wind, no movement, nothing at all. The forest had gone completely still. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, listening for any sign that the thing would return. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into a shallow sleep, though it felt more like drifting in and out of fear. When I woke up again, early morning light was leaking through the tent fabric. Everything inside looked normal. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped outside. The clearing looked calm, untouched. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. But when I walked around the tent, I saw the prints. They were human. The soft dirt around my tent showed at least 4 footprints, clear and deep. The size looked like a grown man's. The prints came from the tree line and stopped directly beside the tent, exactly where I had heard the brushing. Then they turned and moved back toward the trees. There were no boot patterns, just smooth shapes with toes. Either the person was barefoot or wearing very thin shoes. The worst part was how fresh the prints looked. The edges were clean, not softened by wind or time. A sick, cold feeling crawled through my stomach. Someone had walked into my camp in the middle of the night, moved close enough to touch the tent wall, and then walked away without a sound. And I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook so badly I kept dropping things. I kept looking over my shoulder toward the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. Every broken twig or rustle made me flinch. The morning air felt colder than usual, and the forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something had been disturbed. Once everything was packed, I didn't follow the trail back right away. Instead, I cut through the woods in a different direction for a while. I didn't want to make it easy for anyone to predict my path. I walked quickly, trying not to think about the hundreds of places someone could hide in the trees. It took almost 3 hours of constant hiking before I finally reached the gravel road where my car was parked. Nothing seemed out of place around my car, but I still felt watched. I threw my backpack into the back seat, locked the doors, and drove away without looking behind me. Only when I reached a small town almost 40 kilometers away did I finally stop the car. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. It felt too strange, too unsettling. There were no answers, only that one clear fact. Someone had found my camp in the middle of the night and walked right up to my tent while I slept. I never went back to that mountain trail again. Even now, years later, when I think about those footprints and the way the tent wall moved under pressure, I feel the same tightness in my chest. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some wild animal. It was a real person out there in the darkness, silent, barefoot, and close enough to touch me. And the part that still scares me the most is not what they did. It's what they might have been planning to do before they changed their mind. I picked a random spot to camp that night, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Slovakia in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, old enough to know better than to camp alone in a place I had never explored, but young enough to still believe I could handle whatever the forest threw at me. I had spent the morning walking along an old logging road with no signs, no markers, nothing that told me where it ended or how far it stretched. The road felt forgotten, covered in thick weeds and broken branches, but something about its emptiness made me want to follow it. I kept going until the trees on both sides grew so close that the branches touched overhead, forming a long tunnel of dark green. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in fast from the east, long and heavy, thick enough that they smothered the sunlight. I knew rain was coming, so I decided to set up camp before the sky opened. I found a small clearing just off the path where the ground dipped slightly and the soil looked firm enough to hold my tent stakes. The air felt cold even before sunset. I remember thinking it was strange for early July, but I brushed it off. I unpacked my small 2-person tent, fixed my tarp above it for extra cover, and tried to settle in before the weather got worse. The first drops hit the leaves around me like tiny taps. Within minutes, the gentle tapping turned into a steady hiss that swallowed every other sound. The rain came down hard, and the air filled with the smell of wet earth and pine. I crawled inside my tent to escape the storm, but the wind pushed the walls in slightly, making the whole structure breathe in and out like a living thing. I lay on my sleeping mat listening to the steady crackle of rain hitting the tarp above me. It felt comforting at first, the kind of sound that usually makes me fall asleep fast. But the comfort didn't last. About an hour after the rain started, I heard something move in the trees. It wasn't the wind. Wind has a pattern, a long push followed by a slow fade. The sound came in single, clear steps. The ground outside was soft from the rain, and each step landed with a wet, heavy thud. I held my breath and tried to focus. I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. This area was full of them. But something felt off. The steps were slow, careful, as if whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. The steps paused right behind my tent. I lay completely still, my hands pressed against the thin fabric of my sleeping bag. The rain masked most of the sound, but I was close enough to feel the faint vibration in the earth. I thought about grabbing the small knife I kept in my backpack, but I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want to let whoever was out there know I was awake. No breathing, no grunting, no snorting, no sniffs, none of the usual animal sounds, just stillness. After what felt like a long minute, the steps moved again. They circled the tent slowly, like someone walking in a wide ring around me, trying to look in without touching anything. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tarp rustled with the wind, and the rain intensified until it sounded like thousands of needles hitting the ground at once. The storm swallowed most noise, but I still heard each slow step. I counted 7 before the sound drifted farther away, swallowed by the rain. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling of the tent, watching the shadows shake with every gust. The storm kept me pinned inside, and the thought of unzipping the door and looking out filled me with a kind of fear I hadn't felt in years. I didn't sleep. I just listened, waiting for the steps to return. Around midnight, the rain eased just enough that I could hear the forest again. Water dripped from the branches in slow, heavy droplets. The air smelled cleaner, colder. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but right as I began to relax, I heard a new sound. A soft scrape. It came from the side of the tent, low to the ground, like something dragging across the fabric with the back of its hand or with a stick. The scrape moved from one corner of the tent to the other, slow and smooth, too controlled to be an animal brushing past by accident. Then it stopped at the front door, right near my feet. My heartbeat felt loud inside my chest. I could almost feel it pushing against the sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited again. Then the scrape started up the front of the tent, rising from the ground to the top seam in one long motion. It felt like a finger tracing along the outer wall. I felt the vibration of it, faint but unmistakable. The sensation made my whole body tense. Rain started up again, heavier than before, but the scraping continued until it reached the tarp above. Then it stopped as suddenly as it began. I stared at the front of the tent for minutes, ready to jump if I saw a silhouette or a hand press against the fabric. But nothing moved. The storm got louder, and eventually the scraping sound disappeared under the weight of it. Sometime after 2 a.m., exhaustion finally won. My body forced itself to sleep, even though my mind stayed half alert. I woke at dawn to silence. No scrapping, no steps, no storm. Just the smell of wet pine and the soft light of early morning filtering through the tent walls. I unzipped the door slowly and stepped into the damp clearing. The ground was soaked and muddy, but what caught my attention wasn't the dirt. It was the footprints. A clear trail of prints circled my tent, spaced evenly apart, deep enough to show the full shape of the heel and toes. Human footprints, bare human footprints. The mud around them showed no sign of shoes, no tread marks, nothing. The prints walked a full circle around my tent, then stopped at the front door exactly where I had felt the scraping. The surrounding trees were empty and quiet, as if whatever had been there had disappeared the moment the sun rose. I checked every direction, but the footprints didn't lead away. They just ended behind my tent, as if the person who made them had walked around me in the rain, stopped, and then vanished into the forest without leaving a trail. I packed my gear faster than I ever have. My hands shook as I stuffed my tent into its bag. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, waiting to see someone watching me from between the trees. But no one was there. The logging road felt different too. It didn't look like a path someone used. It felt like a place where someone hid. I walked the entire way back without stopping for water, without resting, without looking anywhere except straight ahead. My clothes were soaked with sweat even though the morning was cold. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the small town where my car was parked. The moment I got inside the car and locked the doors, I finally let myself breathe. I knew what I had seen. Those footprints, the slow steps, the scraping, none of it had been in my head. Someone had followed me into that forest. Someone had stood outside my tent through the storm, barefoot, in the middle of the night watching me. I never went back to that road again. I never told anyone locally about it either. There was no point. I had no proof except the memory of that muddy circle and the feeling that someone had waited for the right moment to do something worse than scare me. But the ending was clear to me the moment I reached safety. Whatever walked around my tent that night wasn't lost, wasn't curious, and wasn't passing by. They were out there for a reason, looking for someone camping alone on a night when the rain covered every sound. If I had stepped out of the tent at the wrong moment, if I had made noise, or if the storm had stopped a little earlier, I don't think I would have walked out of that forest the next morning. And that thought has stayed with me more than any ghost story ever could. I planned the trip in late October of 2019, a time when the air in northern New Mexico already carried that sharp cold bite each evening. I was 31 then, working a job that kept me indoors most days, staring at screens until my eyes felt dry and heavy. I wanted silence, space, and a sense of something real, something that didn't glow on a monitor. So I drove out to a remote patch of land near the Sangre de Cristo foothills, a place I had only visited once before on a short day hike. It wasn't an official campground, just a wide stretch of rough dirt, some thin trees, and long broken lines of reddish rock. I chose it because it sat far away from roads and people. At the time, that sounded perfect. I parked at the edge of a slope and took a moment to look around before unpacking. The sky had a washed-out blue color, the kind that almost looks fake because of how empty it is. Dry grass bent lightly in the breeze, making a low brushing sound. The place felt open, quiet, and harmless. I had no reason to think anything different. I spent the first hour setting up my tent, stacking some stones to form a little windbreak, and gathering whatever dead wood I could find. The wood felt dry enough to snap with barely any pressure. I liked the sound of it, sharp and clean, like cracking old bones. When the sun sat low enough to turn the ground golden, I set up my small stove, heated a simple meal, and ate while watching the shadow lines stretch across the field and climb the rocks behind me. By the time dusk fully settled, the temperature dropped fast. That kind of desert mountain cold always feels like it moves straight through your clothes and sits inside your bones. I added another layer and walked a slow circle around my little camp. The sky had no clouds, and every star looked sharp and cold. Nothing seemed strange. Nothing seemed threatening. I felt calm. But later, When I finally climbed into my sleeping bag, there was a strange stiffness in the air. Not a sound, not a shape, just a sudden shift in the feeling of the place. As if the land was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing and closed my eyes. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. No noise, no movement. Just my own eyes snapping open like someone had pulled a string. For a few seconds, I lay completely still, trying to figure out what pulled me out of sleep. The darkness inside the tent felt heavy. I could hear the wind outside brushing the sides of the fabric in soft waves. But underneath that, I sensed something else. I couldn't name it, but it felt like the land wasn't as empty as I believed. I listened harder, keeping my breathing slow. Eventually, I heard a faint crunch, not from the wind, not from settling dirt, something stepping. But it wasn't steady or rhythmic. It was slow, uneven, like someone trying not to make noise but failing, one soft step at a time. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it was an animal, a deer, a stray dog, anything normal. The steps came again, closer this time, dragging slightly, gravel shifting under weight. My heartbeat moved up into my throat, pounding so loud it felt like it filled the tent. The steps stopped just outside, not beside the tent, not behind it, directly in front of the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Something was standing there on the other side of the thin nylon wall. My mind raced through every scenario I could think of. Bear, coyote, lost hiker, anything. But none of those fit the slow, dragging steps I heard. And even if it was a person, what kind of person walks straight to a lone tent in the middle of nowhere at midnight? For a long stretch of seconds, maybe a full minute, nothing happened. Just silence, thick and waiting. Then the shape outside shifted. I heard the faintest sound of cloth brushing against itself, then a long, slow exhale, almost like a tired sigh. I knew then it was a person. The air inside the tent felt tight and thin. I thought about grabbing the knife I kept near the corner of my sleeping bag, but I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want whoever stood outside to know I was awake. I wanted them to lose interest, to move on, to think I was not worth bothering. But they didn't leave. They stayed there, unmoving, for so long that my legs began to cramp in the same position. My shoulders tightened, my breathing grew shallow, and my tongue felt dry. Then I heard steps again, but not moving away. They moved to the side of the tent, slow and dragging, like the person was studying the outline of my body inside the tent. The thin nylon made my shape obvious whenever I shifted. I did everything I could to stay completely still. The person circled halfway around, then stopped again, standing right by the area where my head rested. Another slow exhale, then silence. I don't know exactly how long the person was there. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been half an hour. I only know that some instinct, some deep old fear, kept me frozen until the steps finally moved away. Slow, dragging, uneven, and faded into the darkness. I didn't sleep again. I waited inside the tent until the sky finally began to lighten and the shadows faded. When the first pale morning color touched the rocks, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The cold air stung my skin, but I didn't care. I needed to see everything clearly. The ground around my tent was covered in prints. Not animal prints, shoe prints. Old shoes with uneven soles. One foot dragged more than the other, leaving long, shallow marks. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent, stood in front of it, circled around it, and then walked out toward the low ridge in the distance. My whole body felt cold when I saw those marks. I followed them only a few steps before stopping. They continued toward the ridge, then down into a shallow gully filled with brush and scattered stones. I stood there, staring, trying to imagine who would be walking alone out there at night. But another thought hit me harder. Whoever it was hadn't approached by accident. They walked straight to me, as if they knew I was there. I packed fast, faster than I ever had before. My hands shook while I rolled up the tent. I kept lifting my head, scanning every direction, expecting to see someone watching from the ridge. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. Before I left, I forced myself to walk back to where the person had stood in the night. The prints were clear. The toe of one shoe pointed directly at where my head had been resting inside the tent. The idea of someone silently staring down at me in the dark made my stomach twist. I threw everything into the car and drove out, following the rough dirt path back toward the main road. The whole time, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, dragging one foot slowly across the gravel. When I finally reached pavement, I felt some of the tightness in my chest ease, but not completely. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in a small town nearly 40 miles away. I parked by the far edge and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't report anything. I didn't know what I would even report. A stranger watched me sleep? It felt unreal, even though I knew exactly what I heard and exactly what I saw on the ground the next morning. For weeks after returning home, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise in my apartment, pipes, wind, distant traffic, felt like slow, dragging steps outside my door. I kept seeing that single print, the one facing my head, every time I closed my eyes. But the clearest moment came later, when I finally plugged my phone into my computer to transfer some photos I had taken earlier that afternoon before everything happened. Mixed between the pictures of the landscape and the sky, I found one extra photo. It wasn't mine. It was a photo of my tent, taken from a distance, taken before sunset, taken while I had been out gathering firewood. And there was no one else marked in the frame, just my tent sitting alone in that wide, empty stretch of land, the light fading, the long shadows already reaching across the ground toward it. That was when everything finally made sense. The person didn't just find me in the middle of the night. They had been watching since before I even set up camp. And that was the last time I ever camped alone. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the mountains of northern Colorado. I was 28 at the time, living a hectic city life in Denver, and needed a break from everything: emails, deadlines, and the constant noise of people around me. I packed my old, battered backpack with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I also brought a folding knife and a compass, the kind of small precautions you take when you're hiking into areas that aren't exactly crowded. I left early in the morning and drove up the winding roads of the Rockies, the sun barely peeking over the peaks. The air was crisp, with that clean, dry scent of pine and earth. I parked my car near a trailhead and began hiking in. The plan was simple: hike deep into the forest, set up camp near a small stream I had read about in an old hiking guide, spend the night, and then return the next day. The hike itself was uneventful for the first couple of hours. Birds chirped intermittently, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush kept me alert but not uneasy. I reached the stream around mid-afternoon and found a clearing that seemed perfect. The ground was soft, covered in fallen pine needles, and there was enough space for my tent. I set up my small campsite, collected some firewood, and lit a fire just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The shadows grew long, and the forest became cooler and quieter, with only the sound of water trickling over rocks in the stream. As darkness fell, I noticed a strange smell, faint at first, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I thought it might be a nearby patch of decaying vegetation. The smell grew stronger as I explored a little beyond my campsite, flashlight in hand. That's when I saw it. Half buried under a thin layer of pine needles near the base of a large pine tree was a human leg. The flesh had already begun to discolor, a sickly gray mixed with patches of dark purple. My stomach turned instantly, and my first instinct was to step back and convince myself I had imagined it. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. It was a dead body. From the state of decomposition, I could tell it had been there for at least a couple of weeks. The rest of the body was partially hidden by the tree roots and brush. The arms and torso were twisted unnaturally, one arm bent at an odd angle, fingers curled into the dirt. There was no sign of struggle around the body, and the ground nearby was undisturbed except for animal tracks, probably scavengers. My heart pounded, and I felt a cold sweat on my neck and back. I moved back to my campsite and sat on a rock, trying to process what I had seen. Panic started to settle in, but I forced myself to think clearly. I wasn't a police officer or a detective. I was just a guy who liked hiking. I couldn't handle a dead body myself. The only thing I could do was alert the authorities and stay safe. I fumbled for my phone, and thankfully, I had a signal, though it was weak. I called 911, and after explaining my location as best as I could, the operator told me to stay put and wait for a ranger to arrive. Time crawled. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush felt magnified. The forest that had felt peaceful in daylight now seemed menacing, almost alive in its silence. I tried to keep my fire burning, thinking the light might deter any wildlife. Shadows danced across the trees as the flames flickered, and I couldn't help glancing toward the area where I had seen the body. Fear mingled with a strange curiosity. I wanted to know who it was and how they had ended up here. Eventually, I heard the crunch of footsteps approaching. Relief washed over me as I saw two forest rangers emerge from the trees, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were professional, calm, and immediately took over the scene. I gave them the details, and they went to examine the body. One of the rangers motioned for me to stay back. I noticed the body more clearly now. The face was partially exposed, gaunt, with sunken eyes that had lost their life, hair matted with dirt and pine needles. The clothing was torn and weathered, suggesting the person had been missing for a while, exposed to the elements. While they worked, I stayed near the fire, my mind racing. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly life can shift from normal to unrecognizable, how someone could vanish into the wilderness and not be found for weeks. The rangers asked me to describe exactly where I had found it, and then they took photos, marked the spot, and radioed for additional assistance. Soon, a small team arrived, including a coroner. They carefully moved the body onto a stretcher, taking care not to disturb anything. I watched as the stretcher disappeared into the forest, and I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The rangers asked me to give a statement at the nearest ranger station before they would let me leave. I packed up my tent and belongings in silence. The forest, once a place of escape, felt heavier now, shadowed by the presence of death I had witnessed. Driving back down the winding roads, I kept thinking about the body, imagining the person's last moments, and feeling a strange connection to a stranger whose life had ended quietly in the woods. The next day, I checked the news. The body had been identified as a man in his early 30s, a hiker from a neighboring state who had been reported missing after failing to return from a solo trip. Authorities concluded he had likely fallen and injured himself near the stream, unable to move or call for help. Exposure had done the rest. There was no foul play, just a tragic accident. Reading the story brought a sense of closure, but it also cemented a lesson in my mind about the fragility of life and the unpredictability of nature. Since that trip, I haven't gone camping alone in remote areas. I still hike and spend time in the mountains, but always with company, always prepared for the unexpected. That night in the forest, staring at a lifeless body hidden under pine needles, changed how I view wilderness. It reminded me that the beauty and peace of nature coexist with danger, and that even in places that feel safe, life is fragile and fleeting. The experience left me shaken, but also strangely grateful. It forced me to confront mortality in a way nothing else had. I realized how important it is to be cautious, to respect the environment, and to never take a single day for granted. Even though I was terrified and disturbed that night, the clarity and perspective I gained stayed with me. I returned home, packed away my camping gear, and started planning trips differently, always with safety, preparation, and respect for the unknown at the forefront. That summer in Colorado, I didn't just see a dead body. I saw a stark reminder of life's unpredictability, of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into something unimaginable. And though the fear lingered for weeks afterward, it also grounded me in a way nothing else could. Nature, I learned, is beautiful, but it doesn't forgive carelessness. And in the stillness of those mountains, I understood that even the quietest places can hide life-altering truths beneath their surface.